When it comes to preaching and communicating, we all know the power of a good story. The good news, the important news to note, is that all of us can actually get better at telling stories. And so today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to share with you 6 tips for better storytelling.
Welcome back to Practical Church Planting. My name is Brian Androsian, and with me is Dylan Dodson. And today we're going to give you 6 tips for better storytelling.
Yep, better storytelling in your story, or in your stories, obviously, and your preaching and communication to keep people engaged. And speaking of keeping people engaged, this episode is brought to you by the Church Co. Check out thechurchco.com/practical for the best church website building platform.
Period.
You want to engage new people and your current people, but new people are the number one people who visit your website. And so if that does not look good, you will not engage them even on a Sunday morning.
That's true.
They will check it out there before they come to visit you. So thechurchco.com, you can see tons of examples. We use them for multiple websites. And if you sign on with them, type in the word practical at checkout, you get 40% off for 2 years. You get to pay less than we pay, and they're a sponsor on the podcast.
I know.
So there you go.
What in the world?
What in the world? Here we go. 6 tips for telling better stories. You know, we're a big fan of this. Funny side note, the other day I tweeted. I was working on Nahum, one of the sermons in Nahum coming up, and I was like, gosh, trying to find some illustrations. So I did like a GIF on Twitter of like some guy, I don't know, banging his head against the wall, whatever. I was like, this is me trying to figure out illustrations for this text. And somebody tweeted me back, was like just preach the Bible. He's like, what's your text? And I was like, oh, I know where this is going. Yeah. So I was like, Nahum chapter 3, I think. No, chapter 2. I don't know. One
that we've all preached through.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I was like, oh, let's see what he says about this. Yeah. And he picked 3 of the verses where they talk. It's like when Nineveh gets overthrown by, Babylon, whatever. And it's like the city gates are flooded or whatever. He's like, this. And I'm like, okay. Well, agree to disagree or something like that. It was just really funny. Yeah. And then we went back and forth. I'll say, then he tagged New City Church in it, to get me in trouble. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't bad at all. It's like, I agree to disagree. And then he was like, what's your text? And I was like, Nahum 3. He's like, he could have used this. And I said, okay. Yeah. I think I did another GIF of that wasn't very helpful.
Was he saying use just what the story says?
Yeah, what the Bible says. Yeah, don't use stories, just read the Bible. Okay. And I was like, well, that wasn't really helpful. And then he tagged New City. So just for fun, I was like, you're not going to, it's like, I don't know. So I got on New City.
Now we're going to get him.
Yeah. New City was like, we actually think adding illustrations is really helpful.
And also, this is the same person.
And it was funny because I know a couple of guys on Twitter were laughing at it or texted me about it.
That's funny. I didn't see that.
But yeah, I was like, well, that's great. But I always like to use the example of if you were to preach very faithfully in English, if you're an English speaker, and you're preaching at a, Korean church where they did not speak English, it doesn't matter how good or faithful your preaching was because nobody is listening.
Yeah.
They cannot understand. I know this is an extreme example, but obviously you're preaching to people who can speak your native language. But you could be saying things that are true and are accurate and are helpful, but if it's boring and nobody's listening, it doesn't matter. And as much as we can say just preach the text, all of your favorite communicators engage you. They just do. And so we've talked about different ways, but we're going to put them all in an episode today. Different ways to tell better stories in your sermon. I'm not saying that I'm good at it now, but I was not good at it at all when I started. And so I've tried to get a lot better throughout the years of this. So here's the 6 tips for telling better stories in your sermons so that people will, listen and be transformed. Number 1, this is more so to set this up, is that you need to assume people will stop listening.
To your story or during your sermon?
To your sermon.
Yeah,
they'll stop listening. They will check out all of us. You preach for as short as 20 minutes or an hour. We all check out at some point. Yep. And so knowing that and not assuming that people are going to listen to you lecture style, because you're not giving a lecture in a seminary classroom that people are paying for, which they still will check out on, that they take a test on, right? If you assume people are not going to listen to me this whole time, it will make you be more proactive about giving illustrations and stories to draw people back in, because stories are helpful for a lot of reasons. 2 of them really quickly that people often don't think about is, 1, it invites people back in when they stop listening. Because if you check out, it's hard to jump back in, what's going on. So it's an easy entrance way to get back in. It's whenever someone says one time, or whenever anyone starts telling a story, you're just automatically drawn in because you're interested in it. Yeah. I remember when I was a kid going to church and having to sit through the big service. I would always listen to the beginning because I knew the pastor would tell a story, and then I would kind of be like, eh. But like they had me, and so that's the big thing is that assume people stop listening, or sorry, number one, it draws people back in, but number two, especially, it gives people a reason to continue to listen. I like to put it this way: people don't care how much you know until you tell a story. Not that you need to tell stories every minute of your sermon, but if it's not engaging, if you haven't made it real to them, if you haven't made it something that they can relate to emotionally, not just intellectually, then it's just like, that's great. They're going to leave and they're going to forget it all.
Yeah.
Just like you and I would, because we are emotional beings. We're actually more emotional than we are rational, which we, even in the day and age, we like to say logic and all that sort of thing. But anyway, assume people will stop listening as you're doing your sermon prep, which will make you be more intentional of trying to find stories and illustrations to explain the text and draw people back in.
And like telling stories does not need to be, I mean, we'll get into more of the details, but it does not always have to be a self-serving thing. Like people want to, we're personal beings. Like people want to connect with you as the speaker, and they want to know you personally and things. And so we're not just, I don't think preaching is meant to be just information dumps, like where I just get up there, dump a bunch of information out, and then people will grow closer to Jesus. Because if that was the case, I mean, you're right. One book has been written on a subject. I mean, the Bible's written. People should just go read it. Like, why listen to you if that's the case? But people want to. I mean, obviously you can explain things and stuff like that. But also, people want to connect with you, and we're personal beings. Like, we want to connect with each other. And so, telling stories doesn't need to be like doesn't need to be looked at as you're just trying to make it about you, or you just want people to laugh, or you just want people to, you want to be engaging and things like that. Well, I want people to be engaged, obviously, not because the story matters, but because what's probably going to come after the story is something that I really want them to remember. And so I want to make sure that they're listening at this point. And it's not that the Bible is boring, or it's not like, these details are boring, but I probably find them more interesting than some people that are listening do, because obviously that's one of the reasons we chose to do this for a living. And so stories, like, you don't need to, if you're someone who has in the past been made to feel bad about using personal things, then I don't know, just an encouragement. Don't, like, obviously don't make it all about you, which we'll talk about later, but people want to connect more with you than just hearing a half hour worth of information.
Yep. So some people will stop listening because they will.
Yep.
And so that will, again, we'll talk about, stories and where to put them, but trying to think of, hey, I need a couple of stories and illustrations. They don't even have to be long. Even a 30-second quick thing, is just a helpful thing. It's also, as a side note, why there's no great place to put it. We call them next steps, but announcements in your service. Putting them at the beginning of the sermon is not a good idea. It's even worse idea if the person preaching is the one giving them, because it's like, everybody's only going to listen to you once, and that's like the first 2 minutes.
Yep.
And if you waste it on announcements, good luck.
Yep. That's right.
It's a bummer. So anyway, assume people will stop listening. That will help you, because you have to be intentional, not just, if I happen to think of a story in this sermon, I'll put it somewhere. It's like, no, going into this, I know I need a couple.
Yep.
And I can spread them out, and it's not always going to be the same formula every time, but just knowing I need some coming in can help you. Mm-hmm. Number 2, I learned this from a book. I've mentioned this a couple times, Do You Talk Funny, by David Nihill, Nihill, or something like that. He's a comedian. I mentioned this book a couple times because it's he talks about the reality that people just assume comedians are naturally funny, and he said, like, a lot of them are actually introverted and blah blah blah, and it's a skill they developed. Like, you can develop it, and maybe you care about it more. I'm sure there's some talent involved in it, but it's not true that, like, people are just funny in terms of, like, stand-up comedy, because it's not just, you can't just, being a stand-up comedian, it's not just about having a quick wit. So some people are more quick-witted than others, but it's about developing a material and learning why people laugh and connecting things together. Like, it's a skill. And anyway, one of the things he says in the book, I don't know if I always do this. I try to think of it. I'm sure I don't always do it. But he says this, and here's a second tip. Share your stories in the present tense. So if they happened in the past, you can set it up as, hey, this happened. But then as you're telling the story, you need to tell it in the present tense, because that people think, I'm kind of butchering it here, but people think in the present. And so if you keep saying things past tense, it's harder for them to put themselves in the story. Whereas if you tell it in present tense, even though it didn't happen to them, they put themselves in the story, and then they can experience it better. So for example, let's say I'm telling a story about something that happened to me when I was in middle school. You could set this up by saying, hey, when I was in middle school, instead of continuing to say the story, like, hey, I was in middle school and I was walking to school and I was talking to my friend and we were talking, it's like all past tense. You would set this up in the sense of, like, Hey, so when I was in middle school, me and my friend, we were walking to school, or as we're walking to school, we're talking about this, and I'm saying that I'm going to go do this thing, and so it's not past tense. If that makes sense, I didn't. I probably should have thought of a better example, but that's how it works. And so set it up as this happened in the past, but explain it as it's happening right now. And people psychologically will stay more engaged because they will put themselves in the story, and it's harder to do that if it's in the past tense.
Yeah, I think this is a good example of, in general, I mean, this is kind of like maybe this is tip 2B, but of like, how do you put this? Like study the craft, I guess is the way to put it. Like learn about telling stories. This is not something that comes naturally to most people because
especially in an American context where we think intellectually driven, not like storytelling.
Yeah.
So.
And like, it's different telling a story from stage than just two people talking because I don't, I got all the time in the world. Like, I don't care if I bore you. And I mean, and you can ask questions back and things like that, but talking from a stage is a different story. So I think this is just, it's not like you need to go and like, obviously in this case it was a comedian, and I do think there's a lot to learn from comedy. Like a side note, like listening and people that are, use your own judgment of who you want to listen to and stuff. But like, I do think there's a lot to be learned from people that are naturally funny. Just communication in general. But I think studying how to tell stories is really
skillfully
important.
funny.
What'd you say?
You said naturally funny.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. Yes, you're right.
I mean, some of them are very naturally funny.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know if people I listen to are naturally funny, but people who are funny, I guess is the way to put it. But I just think there's a lot to learn from them. And so whether it's tips like keeping things in the present tense or how they deliver things, and it's not like the point is to come away with people thinking that this is just the funniest sermon ever.
Right.
But I'm a firm believer, and I've fallen into the trap before where people have only mentioned things that were funny and not anything else from a sermon, and where I felt like I probably need to reel back a little bit, and I'm probably getting a little out of hand with trying to make things funny. But I do think like I don't think unless I don't know, unless God tells me himself. Like I don't think anyone's going to convince me that you shouldn't have humor in a sermon ever. I mean, obviously there's certain times where it's inappropriate, but like in general, because I just think that's people reconnect when they laugh, and people if they're laughing, that means that they're listening. And so I think most of us, and myself included, are not naturally funny. Yeah. And so studying this from people that are and taking the tips from the people that have done this before, I think is really helpful.
And again, sharing things in the present tense goes to show you that is a skill that you can work on. Like it doesn't matter your natural ability, and assuming that you can't tell stories will mean that you can't tell stories. If you just think that I'm not someone that can tell good stories, that means then you won't ever tell good stories. It doesn't mean you're going to be the most engaging orator that's ever lived, but it is something that all of us can actually improve on. And so you have to put yourself in the mindset of I actually can get better at this.
Yep.
And so again, reading, like I would just highly recommend, do you talk funny? It's just, he just talks about, I'm not the funniest person in the world, but it's just, here are skills that you can do to help engage people, because comedy is not just about making a joke. Again, it's about engaging people and doing things in a certain way so that people are listening to you as you're telling your story, or else they wouldn't laugh. And so sharing them in the present tense, if it happened in the past, again, I mean, if it's not a personal story, then obviously that's different.
Yeah.
But if it's a personal story, there are times where it doesn't work, but oftentimes it can. Set it up, hey, this happened, and then once everyone's there, start talking about it as if it was happening right now and not kept, in the past, because it's easier for people to put themselves in the story if it's in the present.
Right.
Number 3, don't make yourself the hero. Now, this is, again, if you're sharing stories, personal stories, which are always the best if you have them, you can't, even if your desire is not to make yourself look good, if you do make yourself look good, people just don't really want to hear that.
Yep.
And a lot of this is really cultural. And so, I think for a lot of human history, telling stories where you're the hero, people wanted that. But in our context today, where, we're supposed to not be prideful and arrogant and that sort of thing, which of course there's good reasons. I mean, that's good not to do.
Yeah.
People don't want to hear stories where they're the hero, especially if it's a story about faithfulness, like doing the right thing. Like I'll never forget, I was reading a very well-known book that many of you would know if I said it about disciple making. And one of the things that rubbed me the wrong way was he kept the author. He had great stuff, and I don't think this was his intention. Like I really don't. I don't know him, but I don't think it was his intention. But he kept sharing stories where he did what he was saying.
Yeah.
And it's okay, maybe once or twice, but I was like, tell me a time where someone else did it or where you did not do it. But it kept being, and then he even used an example or two about his wife, like when he, I don't know, helped disciple his wife or helped her see. I'm like, oh, like this is the worst. Not only are you the hero,
Yeah.
but it's like my wife messed up and I came to the
I
rescue
fixed
because
it.
yeah. And I was just like, I'm sure that wasn't his intent, but I was very turned off by the book.
Mhm.
And it's not that I wouldn't recommend it, but whenever I do talk about it, I say, yeah, this is what I didn't like. So,
Yeah.
but it was just like, look at how great I am. And so now again, it's different if it's a funny story if it's like, it doesn't matter where you like learn how to do something. I mean, you get that, but if it's a story, particularly about faithfulness or doing something right, it's always best to tell stories where someone else did it or tell a story where you failed at it.
Mhm.
That is typically the most engaging, and so never making yourself the hero. There are exceptions to that.
Of course.
Every once in a while there might be an exception to that, but it's typically speaking, you don't want to make yourself the hero, even if your goal is not to make yourself look good, because people just in our culture today, we don't like how that comes across.
Yep, and it's not like you can never it's hard to say. Like if you've done something well, it's not like that can never be mentioned. But if I think you can you can build up a little bit of like equity in this, I guess. Like if it's not something that you're regularly sharing, like if you're regularly talking about, and I think most of us should in a lot of cases, like these are the ways that I haven't lived this out, or this is the ways that I've struggled with this, whatever. Then like the very rare occasion where you're like, I actually like I made big strides in this. This is something I did really well. I feel like that'll be a lot more well received than if that's just your go-to for stories, or if you never tell stories and that's the only thing that you mention. But people, I don't know. I think that people want to know that their pastor is human, and if your only stories are this is what you should do, and this is what I did, this is when I did it, and this is how everything worked out so well. It's like this isn't. It just feels like this isn't reality. Like it feels to me, it comes across as if like you're kind of out of touch with your own reality, and you can't or you just don't want to admit that you also have faults, and we all do. And I think people really connect with when you're willing to be honest about those faults than just trying to make yourself look good in the stories.
So so obviously share things that you found helpful, that were impactful for you, but it's never in the sense of, so if you do these things, you can be like me.
Yeah.
People just don't, it just doesn't connect well. And so, if you're looking for an illustration where somebody did something well or based on a point or whatever, just either use a time when you didn't do it well. That's people like self-deprecating humor, or you give it a different example or scenario, or like if it's something that's really inconsequential, again, that's fine because nobody really cares. But if it's a significant thing in your life or an important thing, if you make yourself your hero, people will not like they won't like that.
Yeah, or it's like something you can if you can like contrast it with a way you did it poorly in the past. Like I've grown in this area. This is the way I used to treat my family or something. But because of these different situations, this is how I've grown in it. Then you can kind of see like, hey, I'm not just naturally perfect, or perfect at all, obviously, but I'm not just naturally good at this thing, but because of whatever, I've grown in it, and we can grow together, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, because there's a difference between talking about growth you're making and having arrived. And when you're heroes normally arrive. And so if it's like I have arrived, then, and maybe you have, but that's just not worth it. That's not a good story that you want to share.
Yep.
Number 4, this is, this maybe like, what does it have to do with stories? We talk about this a lot in terms of sermon prep. We call it message collaboration, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't really matter. But having someone or a couple of people that you can talk through your sermon with. Again, to do this well, we recommend getting at least 1 week ahead. That way you don't like write the sermon for a couple of days and then have to give it, talk through it with people, and they give you a lot of feedback, and it's just could be stressful to like fix all that stuff. But having someone that you can talk through the sermon with, get their ideas, get their feedback, is what we've done for 3 or 4 years now. And it's really helpful. It takes a lot of the weight. I mean, we've talked about sermon stuff in previous episodes, so not get all there, but it takes a lot of the weight off of sermon prep in general, because someone else is going to see it. But also, it's like, I need stories here, and I don't know what it is. So there will be often times where I'm like, I need a story about X, and I won't have one. Now, granted, I try to at least think of a couple. Like, it really does stink if I go to our message collab with, personally, I want 2 to 3 stories a sermon. That's a good goal. And depending on how good the story is, it kind of depends on how long it can go before you need to tell another one. Like if it's just really engaging, then you can go a while. If it's like a really quick anecdote and you only have 2 of them in the sermon, people are going to check out and have a hard time coming back in. But anyway, going over the sermon with other people allows me to say, I need a story about this. And sometimes we find a story, sometimes we don't. But it's guaranteed almost every time when I have like I have like no stories, and I'm like, this is bad. I will always walk away with at least one or two. Now maybe I want one or two more, but I've at least got a couple that I did not, at least one that I did not have. And if my goal is 2 to 3 in a sermon, it doesn't always work out that way, and sometimes there's more. But it takes some of the weight off of, I don't know what to do. And so even if we talk about how personal stories are the best type of stories. Obviously, someone else can't tell you about your life, but you can have someone's, ask a question like, "Did this ever happen to you?" And so as you're talking, you're like trying to think of, okay, what did this ever happen to me or whatever. And so doing the message collab thing, talking through it over, it's not just good for content, but it's really good for illustrations and stories.
Yeah, and it's we do message collab, and it's not like every time Dylan needs a story, I'm like, got one.
Right.
But like sometimes I'll have a story that happened in my life, and Dylan he's not going to use that, but that might trigger something to like a memory or something. Or we've been working together for 5 years now. I might remember a story that's told a long time ago, or something that I've like seen that he could use. But it's not always like a perfect magic bullet where as long as you do message collab, you'll never run out of stories. But it's just another resource of someone that can help be like a sounding board of how to come up with some.
Yep. So yeah, it's great. Again, they can't tell stories for you, but they might have something in their life talk through. But going over with somebody, and what I would recommend is, so typically how I do it is, I'll have a couple of points throughout a sermon. I don't need a story with every single point. Now, if it worked and if it was at least a quick one, that would be great. But that's not realistic. I get that. But I'll often say like story here, a couple, throughout the thing, knowing I don't need a story on every single one.
Yeah.
I just need like 2 more. And so if we can find a story for, any of these examples. So I'll let it say like, don't that way it can help the people maybe going over it with you, that if you don't like include like, hey, I need a story here, that they might not have thought about it. But if you say, hey, I need a story here, it might actually make them think of something, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it helps to give a little bit of like some context of what story you want. Like need a story about a time when I don't know, failed at something or succeeded at something or something like that. So at least then you have an idea, because otherwise it's just, then the other person has to read through what's coming up, kind of interpret it and see like what story would fit in and kind of in real time, where it's a lot more helpful to just tell them like, I need a story about this, and maybe nothing will come up, but at least it gives kind of some direction to where you're headed.
Yep. So again, you can't do that if you don't talk it over with other people, but making notes. And it's also just helpful too, because again, if you're working by the assumption that people will stop listening, the easier thing in sermon prep, I think, for most people is explaining the text. And even coming up with points. That's not too bad, especially if you've been doing it for a while. It's not, but trying to find a way that it's actually engaging can be really hard. And so what can happen is you could sit there for 30 minutes, banging your head on a table, trying to think of a story, or you could say, sit for a while, but then just make a note. And so when you talk through it, later on with somebody or with multiple people, you can know that, hey, I might get something here, and you can keep going. So that's number 4. Number 5 is to, depends on the type of story, but if it's a personal story, to never read it. And what I mean by this is, if you're someone that uses a manuscript, nothing wrong with that. One of the things that I often tell guys is you shouldn't read your story. So one, not reading it gives you some more time for eye contact, but it just comes across as very disingenuous and how did you not know this? Like, it just seems weird when somebody tells a personal story about themselves and they're reading it from a page. And you can do this. So one of the easiest things to do, no matter how many notes you use, is to not write out your stories in your notes. You can just, like in bold or in all caps or however you do your notes, you could just say story about X. And you've gone through your sermon hopefully a couple times before Sunday, so you know what the story is, and it's okay if it's imprecise and it's not perfect. Now there might be times where you need a detail, so obviously have it or whatever. But don't read your own stories, because it's disengaging to look down as you're telling your own stories, and it's just like you know what they are. Now, if you don't have a personal story and let's say you're just reading a funny story about whatever, my encouragement there is, you got to read it, but memorize the punchline, like the end of it. Don't be looking down, especially if it's like a unexpected ending or something funny, which, if it's a funny story, typically the ending is something you didn't expect. Do not read it. You need to have that memorized. And so you don't have to memorize the whole thing, and people get that. But like, if you're looking down at the climax or the main point of the story, you lose people. And so never read them if it's a personal. Memorize the punchline if it's something that you're reading, something that you have to read. But when you're telling the thrust of it, looking at people so they're actually engaged with you is really important.
And I think this really helps. I think one of the big things with storytelling is is being able to kind of gauge where the congregation is. And what I mean by that is there's been times where I've told stories where I realize as I'm kind of telling it, like, this is not landing with anybody, and like people are not engaged with this, and I have a million more details. I can talk about this for a few more minutes, but people are not, this is not as engaging of a story as I thought it was going to be. And so maybe it's time to get to the point of it or whatever, but I don't need to keep adding these ancillary details that I thought were engaging but turns out are not. But if I'm just reading from a manuscript or reading the story, then I'm going to include everything that I plan to include. And on the flip side, there's times where I thought, like, this is only going to be okay. And people were a lot more engaged with it. And I was like, okay, maybe we can talk about this for 10 more seconds or something like that, or a little bit of time, because I have, there's other details that maybe I wouldn't have included, but people are engaged with it. And so I can keep their attention longer. But if you're just reading from it, then you can't really adapt to the situation. You're just kind of going with, this is what I already pre-planned to say. And you're right. I think it's kind of disingenuous, and it makes it seem like this isn't I don't think people are like, oh, he made this up, he can't, but I think people are like, well, maybe it comes across as if maybe a little unprepared, or maybe just like a lack of confidence in general, to not have your own stories memorized. But I think part of it is just, I think it is a lesson in confidence, and be comfortable with the fact that you'll forget things. What I used to do is I would never write out a story. Is I'd be like, story about whatever, and then I put like bullet points below it, because I know I know I'll forget, or I may forget, and I want to mention these things. But if you're telling a story in an engaging way, I realized, like, I should just stop putting those in, because I'd forget to look down, and sometimes I'd forget the things, and sometimes I wouldn't. But then I'd look down at my notes when I was going on to the next thing, and I was like, oh, okay, well, it's kind of pointless just to take up the space with these things. So practice the story ahead of time. If you're going over your message, make sure you're actually practicing your stories. But have the confidence and the comfortability that you'll forget some things, and that's fine. And if it's a good enough story, or if you're confident enough in your story, it'll work well, even if you forget every single detail.
And it's helpful to take it out of your notes too, because even if you don't need it, it's because it's there. You might look down on it just because you can, even if you don't need it. And I also say this, even with like being funny, it's wrong to assume the communicators or the preachers that you like are just naturally good at stories, and you're not, and so it must be nice. Like I promise you, they spend a lot of time trying to figure out, because I've seen, it's not that I know a lot of these well-known preachers, I don't, but like from following them, reading some of their stuff, hearing some interviews about like sermon writing process, like a lot of the people that are like really well-known, really good, it's actually pretty methodical what they're doing. It's not like they're waking up on a Thursday morning and writing a sermon in 3 hours and be done for Sunday. I'm good. The same thing with stories. It's like, you spend time with it. And so I think more people, for a lot of people, stories and illustrations is where they need to spend more time, not another 3 hours reading a commentary to make it real for people. And so it's a skill that you can develop, and not putting it in your notes, but remember, really owning the story, talking through multiple times out loud by yourself so that you know that you have it, and being okay with forgetting a couple things is fine too. But do not read your stories, but spend more time on them than you might think that you need.
Yep.
So that's important there. And then last but not least, I just started doing this. We've been talking about this. I just call this, I don't know what else to call it, so we'll call it a story tracker, a way to track stories. I wanted to do this for a while, and people talk about Evernote and all that sort of thing. And Evernote, I've tried it a couple times in the past, and it was too confusing for me. Now, granted, I'm sure I could try harder, but I was like, that doesn't seem like a good thing. And I don't know, just putting them all somewhere. Like, I needed it to be somewhat searchable, but I don't know how you do it. Part of it was the fear of wanting to have a perfect system, but also just getting very frustrated of like, I know I have stories. And so anyway, I have tried. I'm only a few weeks into this. So I don't know how this will go long term, but I finally started tracking stories, and literally today I added 2 stories, two sermons, and like 30 seconds where I needed one this morning. But because I was working on this week. Well, the next sermon I'm preaching, I'll work on it on Monday morning, and I needed a story somewhere, and I was like, oh, I have one. And then I was like, but wait, I think I shared this another sermon back to back. So I looked it up. Anyway, I looked at my notes, and both of them needed a story about blank. And I had 2 stories in my in my Apple Notes. It was great. It all felt so good. I doubt it's always going to be that good. But anyway, so what I'm doing, I don't know if this is helpful for you. A couple weeks ago, maybe 6 to 8 weeks ago by the time this episode airs. Josh Howerton on Twitter, who I would just, if you're on Twitter, I would highly recommend him. He's super encouraging from a ministry perspective, but also just really honest about biblical truths. I mean, it's just really refreshing. But anyway, he has like a lot of tips or whatever. And so he did this thread on sermon notes and how he uses Apple Notes. And I'm like, but how did you do it? So anyway, I still don't understand how he fully does it.
Yeah.
But I watched a couple of videos on YouTube on Apple Notes and how it works and how it syncs between your computer and your phone. And I was like, I'm going to try it. And I don't know how it's going to be and how searchable it's going to be, but because you can search in there like keywords and key phrases. And so even as I write out the stories, maybe they'll pop up. I don't know. And as I do it, maybe I'll get better at categorizing them because I put some hashtags on there, but I'm not sure how helpful they're going to be. But at least I can like type in word anyway. But I've been but having a tracker was really helpful. So like for example, a couple weeks at our last elders meeting, I was telling a story about my dad and my grandmother and like pie and how she told him it wasn't necessary.
Oh,
and you're like, you've never told that
That was a
story.
good story, yeah.
And I was like, I have never told that story because I would just like forget. It's a really funny story, but I just like don't always think about it.
Yeah.
I was like, well, let me just put it in there. So I typed it in there, and then there was one here that we put up right now. I got a folder, preaching illustrations, and then I was listening to one of Josh Howerton's things was if you're listening to sermons, which I've been doing more lately, if someone has a story that you note it.
Yeah.
Now he says if it's like a complicated one, you can like link the URL to the sermon, and maybe I should do that at some point.
Yeah.
But I was listening to a sermon about a husband and a fictional story about a husband who was sick and his wife had to do all these things, and like he couldn't have any stress for a year, and so she had to like cook and clean, blah blah blah. And so she comes back into his room, and her husband's like, "So what did the doctor say?" And she was like, "You're gonna die," because she wasn't gonna do all that stuff. But anyway, it was really funny. But I wrote them down in my folders, in my preaching illustration folder, and I was like, "Oh, let me just," and it worked. So I don't know if it's always gonna work that great, but that's what I'm using now. But some sort of tracker, and again, I haven't done this for a while because I wasn't sure how to start. But I know how I'm doing it now is not going to be the best. But I'll get better at it as I go. Yep. And anyway, I've only been doing it for a couple of weeks. Somewhat skeptical this was going to work, but it's worked so far, which is really cool.
Yeah, I think it's helpful just to have. I mean, we talk about this a bunch, but like, don't wait to figure out the perfect system before you're starting something.
Yeah.
Like I started doing. I think we both actually saw the same thread. So I started doing it around the same time. That we didn't talk about it for like 2 weeks after that. But I started doing it in a Google Doc. Not the best. Like I have the stuff in there fine. It's not super accessible from a phone without a few steps, which I don't like. And so I'm pretty close to abandoning Google Docs and moving it somewhere else. Yeah. But I think it's good to have something because I mean, especially if you preach every week, you will run out of stories. Like we talk about this a lot, like when doing our message collabs and stuff like that. Like so often it's like need a story about this, and we're like, didn't we just talk about needing a story about that? And I mean, you talk about similar stuff over time, and you don't want to always reuse the exact same thing every time a topic comes up. And so having something like this, I think, is a good way to help kind of refresh your memory and help. I mean, we're never going to remember everything, so help keep stuff as a kind of a accessible database for you.
And if you have a good story tracking process, you could post it in our Facebook group. It's a really helpful practical church planning group on Facebook for everyone. But I like the Apple Notes. I mean, maybe Android has something similar because you can access it from your phone and your computer, and it's everywhere. And I know Evernote you can too. I don't know how complicated it is. The Apple Note system is like really simple because oftentimes if I'm listening to a sermon or if I'm out somewhere, I just want to type it in on my phone. But then having access to it on my computer during sermon prep is really helpful as well. And so anyway, I've just started doing this, and hopefully I mean, I plan to keep doing it. I'll probably get better at it. But just trying to remember stories that you're not sure. Things happen in your life that are really cool, but it's easy to forget them. And so just having them there and looking after them later can be helpful.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
One thing too with telling stories is not a point, but just that you can repeat stories. So you might be tempted to think I've shared the story, can never say it again. I found I forget who. It was a couple of years ago when I first heard someone, and there was someone from a large church. She's like, "Yeah, people never forget," or she's like, "People don't remember."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh, well, you got a lot of people there," and I think like 9 to 12 months you can repeat a story, and once you do it, like I mean, you'd have to be preaching for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Maybe not that, but like you have a lot of different people. People don't come every week, and they genuinely forget. And honestly, if they remember. If the handful of people that do remember is like, it's not like I haven't heard it in 9 months or a year. So it's fine.
Right, yeah.
And it's still a way to engage people back in. And so one of the ways that you can do this, we use Google Docs for our sermons. And so like I have like a folder with all of my sermons, right? So it's really easy for us to type in to search like story about whatever, and it probably will pop up, so we can really get a good time of like, when was the last time I shared this story? But don't be afraid to reuse good. Now, if it's a really good story, people might remember it, so that might be different. But if it's like small anecdotal stories, I mean, even if it's a good story, you can reuse it too. But you do need to give it some time. But reusing stories is also, you can do that. If you never thought you could, I'm telling you, you can. People will forget.
Yep. And the only last thing I'll add is like, I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but make sure you're listening to other pastors' sermons. Like it's helpful to not that you're trying to emulate anybody or that you're trying to just copy what they're doing, but if you're never listening to somebody else and someone that's better than you, then it's going to be hard to increase some of these skills if you don't actually hear it done well. And so I can think of a couple pastors. Like I can think of one that we saw at a conference. He's a I don't know, relatively well-known pastor, I guess. But one of the stories that he told and kind of the way he told it, I still remember like a few years later, and I still remember like what he was talking about because he told it in such an engaging way. And I don't listen to him. Like I don't have anything against him, but he's just not someone who I regularly listen to. But it still stands out to me this one time that he was telling a story, and I think just listening to people that are really engaging is really helpful. Now, like in this person's situation, he was very animated and kind of all over the stage kind of person, and that's not really, I don't know, my personality. So like I'm not trying to copy what he's doing by any means, but it's just helpful to hear the way that people communicate and hear the way people tell stories. And I think that's one of the biggest ways you're going to increase or improve your storytelling is by actually hearing people that are doing it well.
And in order to maximize this, having a story tracker. So it's hard to remember. So again, I just started, and so I've been, as I listen to sermons, I've been throwing them in there, which is like super helpful.
Yeah.
Now, don't lie. If it's their personal story. Don't make it your personal story.
Yes,
but if they're telling funny stories, like the doctor and the wife stories, it was obviously fictional, and I was like, I was like, that was funny, but I would forget that. There's no way.
Sure.
But because I wrote it down, and then I saw my sermon notes this morning, I needed a story about like an unexpected ending or something where things didn't go well, and it was just like this was perfect. And the only reason I had it is because I wrote it down.
There you go
on the story tracker. So
anyway,
those are 6 tips for telling better stories. More than anything else, I just want you to know that you can tell better stories. You don't have to be the funniest person in the world. For some reason, Chris Rock came to mind, which, the whole thing with Will Smith. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Not that I shouldn't say that, but I don't know. Maybe that's why he came to mind.
Right.
Oscars. Yeah. Anyway, you don't have to be him.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be him. You don't have to be the funniest person in the world, but you can get better at it, and it'll be a blessing for your people as you improve.
Yep.
So thanks for listening today. Again, thechurchco.com/practical to get 40% off a new website. You can join us on our Practical Church Planting Facebook group as well to ask questions about storytelling or anything else in ministry. And we'll be with you next week on Practical Church Planting.